Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today's my lecture is about neurophysiology of visual pathway. Visual or optic pathway is the nervous pathway that transmits impulse from retina to visual center in cerebral cortex. In binocular vision, the light rays from temporal, that is outer half of visual field, fall upon the nasal part of corresponding retina, and the rays from nasal, that is inner half of visual field, fall upon the temporal part of retina. Visual receptors are rods and cones. The fibers from the visual receptors synapse with the dendrites of bipolar cell of inner nuclear layer of retina. Visual pathway consists of 6 components. These are optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, lateral geniculate body, optic radiation, and visual cortex. This is the course of visual pathway. At first, optic nerve. The visual nerve signal leaves the retina through the optic nerve, which is formed by the axons of ganglionic cell, and leaves the eye through optic discs. The fibers from temporal part of retina are in the lateral part of nerve and carry the impulse from nasal half of visual field of same eye, and the fibers from nasal part of retina are the medial part of nerve and carry the impulse from temporal half of visual field of same eye. Here we want to show this. And secondly, optic chiasma. Medial fiber of each optic nerve crosses the midline and join the uncrossed lateral fibers of opposite side to form the optic tract. This area of crossing of the nerve fiber is called optic chiasma. Thirdly, optic tract. Due to crossing of medial fiber in optic chiasma, the left optic tract carries the impulse from temporal part of left retina and nasal part of right retina. That is, it is responsible for vision of nasal half of left visual field and temporal half of right visual field. And the right optic tract, which contain the fibers from nasal half of left retina and temporal half of right retina, that is responsible for visions of temporal half of left visual field and nasal half of right visual field. Fourthly, lateral geniculate body. Majority of the fibers of each optic tract then synapse in the dorsal lateral geniculate nucleus of thalamus, which locate at the dorsal end of thalamus. It is also called lateral geniculate body. From here, the geniculocalcarine fibers passes by the way of optic radiation to the primary visual cortex in the calcarine fissures area of medial occipital lobe. This is the last relay of visual pathway. The visual fibers also passes to the several older area of the brain. These are to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of thalamus, secondly pituitary nucleus in midbrain, thirdly superior colliculus, fourth ventral lateral geniculate nucleus of thalamus. Thus, the visual pathway can be divided roughly into old system and new system. In human, the new system is responsible for perception of virtually all aspects of visual forms, colors, and other conscious vision. This is the figures of principal visual pathway from eyes to visual cortex. Dorsal lateral geniculate nucleus serves two principal functions. First of all, it relays visual information from optic tract to the visual cortex by the way of optic radiation. This relay functions is so accurate that there is exact point-to-point transmission with a high degree of spatial fidelity all the way from the retina to the visual cortex. Secondly, the dorsolateral geniculate nucleus is the gate to transmission of signal to the visual cortex, that is, to control how much the signal is allowed to pass the cortex. Fifth, optic radiation. Fibers from lateral geniculate body pass through the internal capsule and form optic radiation. The fibers between lateral geniculate body and visual cortex are called geniculocalculent fibers. Optic radiation ends in visual cortex. Visual cortex located primarily on the medial aspect of the occipital lobes. Like the cortical representation of other sensory system, visual cortex divided into primary and secondary visual cortex or area. At first, primary visual cortex, which is also called visual area number 1, also called striate cortex, because this area has a grossly striated appearance. It lies in the calcarine fissures area, extending forwards from the occipital pole on the medial aspect of each occipital cortex. Its area number is 17, which is concerned with the perception of visual impulse. Secondly, secondary visual areas, which is also called visual association area, which lies lateral, anterior, superior and inferior to the primary visual cortex. Its Broadband area number is 18. It is also called visual area 2 or simply V2. Okay. Most of this area fold outwards over lateral surface of occipital and parietal cortex. Secondary visual signals are transmitted to these areas for analysis of visual meanings. Occipital eye field area number 19 is concerned with the movements of eyes. This figure shows transmission of signals from primary visual cortex into secondary visual area on the lateral aspect of the occipital and parietal cortex. This figure also shows the signal representing form, third dimensional position and motions are transmitted mainly into the superior portions of the occipital lobe and posterior portions of the parietal lobe. Okay. By contrast, the signals from visual details and color are transmitted mainly into anteroventral portion of the occipital lobe and ventral portion of the posterior temporal lobe. At a glance, the visual pathway: at first, visual receptors in retina, then first order neuron, that is bipolar cells in the inner nuclear layer. Secondly, second order neuron, that is ganglionic cells in the ganglionic cell layer, then occipital nerve, then second order neurons, that is ganglionic cells in the ganglionic cell layer, then optic nerve, optic chiasma, optic tract, then third order neuron, which is lateral geniculate body, then optic radiation, lastly visual cortex. This is the representation of the visual pathway. Thank you for your patient sharing.